So welcome to the Politics Seminar today. My name is Jennifer Marshall, for those of you that don't know me. Now, just to warn you, although the presentation's being filmed, the Q&A isn't. So when it comes to the Q&A, everybody can relax and you can move to the front because you won't be videoed, okay? But the actual presentation is. But anyway, I'd like to welcome Dr. Barberi Chacha. He's a visiting scholar from Kenya. He's actually a senior lecturer in African history in the Department of Public Affairs and Environment Studies in Kenya. And he's also founded the Centre for Human Rights and he's Director of External Linkages for that centre. Now, his main research interest is on political assassinations and human rights. So although he's, a senior lecturer in history, obviously there are major political connections there with what he's going to talk about. And today his talk is entitled The Scars of Memory and Scales of Justice, a history of political assassinations in Kenya from 1963 to 2017. So, please, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In January 1961, Patrice Lumumba was handed over to his enemy in Katanga, in Zaire, and the following month, his assassination was announced. When that happened, his death, being the first assassination in Africa, generated a lot of political anguish, and news spread very fast to most African countries, sending shockwaves of fear everywhere. After his death, ironically, what happened is that those people who participated in his own death began to nationalize him. And he became, of course, the first victim of political assassinations in Africa. In January 1963, President Sylvanus Olympio of Togo was assassinated. And within this particular period, this particular assassination, the African Union held a sitting and they drafted Article 3 of the Charter of the African Union. And this charter expressly condemned any manner or form of political assassinations in Africa or conspiracy to it. Now, at this time, when this article was being drafted, African leaders did not have in mind about the occurrence of these assassinations to any other citizens apart from African heads of government. Not long, in 1965, January, the Prime Minister of Burundi, Prince Rwagasore, was assassinated. And immediately, the 16th General Assembly of the UN recalled a sitting and, of course, expressed indignation and profound shock on what had happened. On the other side, the East African heads were also meeting, and of course, they were gripped with a lot of fear and abhorrence, and of course, they saw their lives being unpredictable. Now, the same year, on February 24th of 1965, Gama Pinto, a prominent freedom fighter and Jomo Kenyatta's ally in Kenya, was shot on a close range while opening his gate to his home. Now, this act of a single bullet opened up a Kenyan's history of political assassination. What was to follow was a series of politically inspired killings that came to identify Kenya as an assassination-happy state. Gama Pinto's death was seen as a consequence of an interplay between the introduction of socialism and, of course, the British and US interest in Kenya. And, of course, being rude to the establishment, to Jomo Kenyatta. On 2nd of March, 1975, Kenyatta's very own personal friend and a personal secretary, J.M. Kariuki's body was found in Kajiado, and it had been mutilated beyond recognition. Of course, at the same time, rumors were going on that he had been seen walking in Zambia, in Harare. Being recognized as the first African man to ride on a horse, J.M. Kariuki had made significant connections through Kenyatta's influence to know luminaries in world affairs like Golda Meir, and being a personal friend to Gamal Abdel Nasser. And therefore, he was becoming powerful in the Kenyatta regime, and this had to be silenced. The consequences, of course, of this kind of murder was riots that began taking place in the University of Nairobi, and where many university students were beaten up by the police and injured. And of course, his death, like Gama Pinto's death, were investigated, but the findings never to be known up to date. After the J.M. Kariuki's murder, Kenyatta had become extremely powerful and yet paranoid. He was identified by the public as a savior of Kenya. As his name suggests, Kenyatta, he was Kenya, and Kenya was Kenyatta, a grand old man of Africa. This syllogism raised Kenyatta's ego, and of course, to a nearby doctrine of Louis V of France. And therefore, to challenge Kenyatta at that time was to challenge the state itself. Therefore, for Kenyatta to transform the Kenyan state at that earlier stage, like many other African founding fathers, it required the elimination of persistent embodiment to his state. Towards the 1960s, therefore, Kenyatta began to personalize and sacralize his authority, and that he became extremely sensitive to public criticism and opposition. What followed was another major assassination that shook the world. On 5th of March, 1969, a genius and a fearless political figure who negotiated for Kenyan independence was shot dead while he was trying to buy medicine in a chemist in Nairobi. Arguably, an architect of Kenyan independence, Tom Mboya had an influence that had transcended beyond African boundaries. Having acquaintance with the President Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. It is actually through this acquaintance that Obama's father came to be a beneficiary of the airlifts that Tom Mboya had created with these kind of connections and scholarships from John F. Kennedy. His killer, Nahashon Njenga, was jailed, but while in jail, he wondered, I quote, "What about the big man?" And of course, again, a commission of inquiry was instituted to find out about his death. Up to now, there isn't anything that has been found. Towards the end of Cold War in Africa, of course, the growing of dictatorship caught up with more victims of political assassinations. This was a period that President Moi took over power. The first victim of that was Robert Ouko, the Kenya's most prominent and brilliant foreign affairs minister. He disappeared from his home, and within 2 weeks, his body, burnt with acid, again beyond recognition, was found near his home. He had attended a meeting with George Bush in Washington, D.C., and this meeting, something went wrong, and of course, the members that went with the meeting together with him, one of the ministers sarcastically called him Mr. President. And when he died, a commission of inquiry was formed. Scotland Yard was invited to investigate his death. And of course, to date, nothing has been made public. The list goes on and on. Titus Adungosi, a university student, in 1988 was also found dead in a prison where he had been detained for a while. What followed again was a death of a bishop, Alexander Muge. Another Father Kaisa, an American priest, was found dead again in 1998. In 2003, during Kibaki's era, so many deaths occurred. Crispus Mbai was shot, dead, after coming from a meeting where the Kenyan constitution was being negotiated. George Thuo, during Uhuru era, died. George Mushai, Meshaki Abei, Jacob Juma, and many others have died since then. And the latest death was about a month ago as a result of the problems of elections and electioneering politics, where one individual who tried to prevent the Kenya Electoral Commission from rigging election was gunned down and his hand cut off. And therefore, in summary, that can be seen that each regime and the kind of prominent political assassinations that took place within that particular period. That is Kenyatta between 1963 and 1978. These are just a few, but of course, some of the assassinations that transcended the boundaries of Africa. Sorry. Okay, and Moi's regime, I can put 4 of them, but of course they are numerous. Kibaki's regime, of course, it is during Kibaki's era that Kenya saw a lot of transformation, but of course, still, you can see that the tradition of this continued. So the problem is, looking at this, as a historian, I would have been able to tell a story for a long time, but of course, time will not be able to allow. But I will be able simply to look at a few things about Kenyan history and political assassinations. Now, one interesting thing about this is that it has been going on and on, but of course with the recurrence of similar patterns. So that there has been learning from one presidency or regime to another, some particular pattern has been seen, which violence has been used in order to terrorize and silence those ones who are in opposition to it. Interestingly, commissions of inquiries have been set up, but of course these commissions of inquiries are used as scapegoats and to cool tempers. We're going to see that later. And of course, most of them being ineffective. There has been no official acknowledgement or even apology. And you see the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed, and of course that Truth and Reconciliation Commission was not being able to implement most of its findings, and we're going to see what happened. And therefore, Kenyans are anxious to know what happened, especially on these political assassinations and why. If you look at these illustrations I've put here, President Kibaki, who was the third Kenyan president, attended a funeral of J.M. Kariuki's burial in 1975. And in this burial, he said, we are mourning here, not only on his death, but the manner in which he met his death. Even if it takes 100 years, we want to know why he was killed and by who. 42 years later, the daughter of the victim says, my father was dead, cruel hand of injustice struck him down. We were isolated by everyone, including the state, but today I decide to take my own journey to heal. Showing that the state has not been able to do anything about this. Even when Kibaki was the president, of course, he instituted a lot of thanks to Kibaki, because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission at least was able to be formed during his era. Now, the memories of political assassinations normally split nations in a profound way. Past victims, of course, had national mourning. Now, today, they continue to haunt many nations, including Kenya. They carry ethnic tag. Remember the first 3 assassinations. They said our our heroes died. But today, those heroes are identified within the context of their ethnicity, meaning the ethnicity being a clear mark of political calculations in Kenya. Therefore, they tend to divide the nation in a very big way. To explain this, while speaking in Oxford, Soyinka decided to dwell on the subject of memory and forgiveness. He talked about reconstituting the vanished components of the world we have lost. And of course, he was trying to talk about the countries beginning to deal with their past and beginning to apologize for what happened. And of course, like what Soyinka was trying to say is like what E.P. Thompson was admonishing historians to rescue casualties of history from enormous condensation of posterity. Now, like as a historian, it is our duty, therefore, to rewrite the history of Kenya and be able to expose some of these things, because memory is significant if it is brought forth for a nation to continue. Now, in an interesting way, I attended a meeting where we were celebrating 200 years of end of slave trade in Cape Coast in Ghana. And of course, it coincided with the 50 years of celebration of Ghanaian independence. And of course, I was one of the historians who did that. A group of American activists shared a story with us that they approached George Bush. They wanted to ask him if they could erect a museum of memory in Washington, D.C. And then George Bush told them that, why will you want to bring shame and these bad memories in a capital city like this? Why will you want to do such kind of a thing? And he told them, the American strength lies in what they forget and not what they remember. So let's forget about that. And of course, that has been a Kenyan problem. And of course, it has been an anthem in Kenyan politics, talking about that we need to forget the past. Let's forget the past and move on, and so on. So in trying to look at this assassination in context of Kenya, history telling in Kenya is extremely elusive and biased. Of course, the way it has been told in high school and how books have been written and so on has created an enormous problem. And of course, as it's been argued, Kenya is in a state of denial, denying it is past and present, and politically speaking. Onyango Loka calls this a calculated historical amnesia and selected amnesia. So the Kenyans tend to choose what to remember and, of course, select also what to forget. And this is politically induced kind of a thing. Yet memory is seen as a prerequisite of healing wounds of the past. Now, states are among the most prolific killers. It's been argued. And as we have seen, like war, political assassinations have produced insecurity in countries around the world in many cases. The elites holding power in a state use that in order to maintain political authority, or even use that power to do so. If you read Mazrui and Zeleza, they tend to argue that way. And over time, killings have become bureaucratized in Kenya, especially for the last 20 years or so. The acts of killing has been passed on from one regime to another. If you look at the style in which J.M. Kariuki was murdered during Kenyatta era, is the same plot and fashion in which Robert Ouko was murdered in the 1990s, in a similar pattern. So the acts of killing have been passed on from one regime to another. And of course, the anthem in Kenyan politics is about, they will make noise, and after 1 week or 2 weeks, they will forget about it. And life will keep on, and things will be normal. It's become an assassination anthem. And therefore, people are being killed and people protest within 1 week, everything is forgotten. Now, political assassinations, if you try to explain, are prone to states that suffer from restrictions of political competition, as we have seen it in the context of Kenya. In the same way, where there is strong polarization and fragmentation, speaking about Kenya, that period end of Cold War, Kenya was characterized with that kind of tension. Now, election tensions, Kenya has been known worldwide for its elections. Right now, the Kenyan election is still on. We voted about 3 weeks ago. The case went to court, and then the opposition won. the election was nullified, and now people are campaigning. Immediately after the campaign, whoever wins, the following day, it will be campaign again for the next 5 years. And therefore, it goes on and on and on. Again, as you can see, states use assassination to enhance influence and legitimacy. Kenyatta tended to use that in order to maintain his supremacy. Opposition leaders, of course, they become more targeted in a system, in an authoritarian system like that, or in a weak democracies, in order to perpetuate power. About Kenya, it's about the crisis of legitimacy and integration, belonging, and of course, asserting authority. Sometimes it has occurred in a situation whereby somebody wants to survive elections, or there's a very clear succession order. Finally, it can also occur to seek media attention or sympathy, or sometimes to warn people that if in case this happens, this is what is going to happen to you. And of course, Uhuru's presidency has exemplified that very well. In Africa, therefore, Kenya seems to be the most assassination-happy nation, with over 30 major assassinations and disappearances. I have not accounted for all here, but of course, that's how it is. Of course, with the Presidential Guard, 59 members of VIP escort, Special Security Protection Battalion, police motorcycles, the president wears the bulletproof vest, their sniffer dogs, and so on, because of the fear of that has been inspired by previous occurrences in other countries. Of course, it was during Kibaki's presidency that there was it became a turning point in the events of the Kenyan politics. And of course, when Kibaki took over in 2002, it was actually a democratic transition. Since independence, it had not occurred. Of course, it was very, very peaceful. That's why Kibaki had to promise that you have asked me to lead this nation out of the present wilderness into the promised land, and I shall do so. So Kenyans were in expectancy that he was going to do so. And of course, he did. Only that what happened in 2007 again got to define what Kenya was. Of course, that put Kenya in the spotlight, where Kenya went into a post-election violence. And as a result, there was an international outcry where there was a coalition government. And of course, as a consequences, the Kenyan case went to the ICC court. But of course, the main thing that came out of that was that we were able to do a constitution. So there were many institutional reforms, constitutional reforms. Human Rights Commission was set up, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had been set up in that regard. And therefore, Kibaki's presidency ushered in a lot of hope for Kenya. But of course, without forgetting that, of course, within the context of Kibaki's presidency, also, we saw a lot of unexplained deaths and political killings. Now, looking at the Commission of Inquiries which had been formed previously, it is possible that those inquiries they rarely satisfy everyone. They provide quick political fixes, which means they, in response to urgent pressures of the public, they serve as political theaters where with high-profile political witnesses. And of course, it's an arena of state propaganda. And once they are set up, they take about 2 or 3 years. And of course, the results of this are not communicated to the people. Now, the most significant aspect which Kenyans used a lot of money to set up was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I knew very well. It was done through the Act of Parliament in 2008. But it was not, the TJRC was not able to implement its findings effectively because of many reasons. One, it failed to work with the media and the civil society. Of course, there was a lot of influence, government influence. It lacked political and moral leadership, as for the South African case, where Mandela provided political leadership and Desmond Tutu provided religious leadership in terms of forgiveness and reconciliation. So there was no commitment among the government or political elite to promote healing and reconciliation at all. Up to today, speaking to you, we do not have an implementation of that report. The campaign credo for the opposition at the moment is that we are going to implement the report if we are voted in. So it was politicized, and to protect the interests of the powerful. The chairman of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the president and his vice president are badly mentioned in that report. So none of them is willing to implement the report. As a matter of fact, the new Kenyan constitution, which was passed in 2010, the vice president and the president do not believe in it. And therefore, they have done many things as possible to make sure that they frustrate it. So again, on the other hand, is about the silence of scholars in talking about political assassinations and, of course, trying to write about this. And, of course, the very reasons is that they have remained silent on this issue. There have been, of course, post-colonial African problems have been talked about: poverty, corruption, insecurity, violence, but very rarely the silent topic of assassination has been touched on. The reason is because of the manipulation of post-mortem materials, and that significant data of this is assassinations are under government custody. It is not easy to access those documents. Post-assassination cover-ups have taken place. And of course, I was very lucky to work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a consultant, and therefore I got preview of the information and documents which were brought into my house. I asked for permission from the commission if I could photocopy some. The chairman of the commission, of course, died 3 weeks ago, allowed me to photocopy some. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission finished its work, I asked them if I can set up a center for Truth and Reconciliation Commission in a university so that people can have access to the records. But of course, government influence over those documents were very deep, and they could not accept. And therefore, still that happens. So the academic sphere, of course, being harassed and silenced, and of course, this has permitted the media. There are so many documentaries from media houses about assassinations, normally come with sweeping. Most of them are sponsored by certain group of political beliefs in certain corners who normally do this for their own political interest. Of course, historians are now faced with a lot of troubling challenges. How they can write an accurate and a responsible history of assassination, not only in Kenya, but in many other countries. That will take a new account into the great new deal of new evidence that keeps on coming as time unfolds, and so on. Well, in conclusion, I would like to say that there are no real perpetrators that has been brought into book as a result of these political assassinations. Majority of those found guilty were only scapegoats. Memory of political deaths are used for political campaigns and provide bargaining power or for ethnic hatred or divisions and so on. Kenyan presidents who have been considered men of might have been unable to protect their own citizens. As Bethwell Kiplagat says, we have both ugly and inspiring history. We need to look at and address our past wrongs to establish conditions of justice in a society that has been wounded in the past. But of course, it is an uncomfortable fact that Kenya is in a leading power in East Africa with an exceptional constitution and flourishing democracy. The specter of assassin can continue to haunt political leaders. The gunman and perceived threat they pose have changed the way Kenya is governed and has been a frequent and repeated excuse for repressive measures. How that fear rather than the actual act of assassination has played part in the making of modern Kenya has been the principal aim of my paper. Thank you very much.